anyway, I do want to talk a little bit about there was a question here about line movements. Is there a better way to look and see line movements? What are others doing for line movements? And I want to spend a little bit more time talking about it on the DFS side and things that I'm looking for in the way I edit my projections. I know that there was also a question from Jonathan Liu last Friday night and said, when should you be adjusting projections, particularly for the NBA? So I think this could be a useful channel, not a useful channel, a useful conversation. But if it isn't, this isn't interesting to anybody, just let me know and pop a question in chat and we will pivot. But I want to come back a little bit to this Fantasy Labs. Let's see. Fantasy Labs page here where they've got the totals and talk a little bit more about the things that we can do and what we are looking for on this page. So let me pull this back up here. It is always good to make sure that you have the most recent projections because this is things have slightly changed since I was last looking at this here. But again, so things that we are primarily looking for when treating Vegas as a signal for us to maybe edit projections. I think there are really 3 of them, I guess. I am looking for, let me think about this. I'm looking for big changes in Vegas's take over the course of the day. I am looking for significant discrepancies between the live Vegas odds and the live SaberSim odds. And I am also looking for, to me, kind of 2 signals are always over 5 runs or less than 4 runs. That can change a little bit as the season goes on and the temperatures come up in the summer and the totals are a little bit higher, but over 5 runs to me is kind of something I'm looking at as like a potential chalky hitting team, and lower than 4 runs is something that I'm thinking about as a potentially chalky pitcher on the other side. So those are kind of my signals, right? And I will start looking here at these things in conjunction. And a lot of times on a big game slate like this, I will go game by game, and I'm looking basically to see what does the live look like compared to SaberSim. Is it a half run or more different? And then what do the trends look like, right? So I'm going to just start walking through some of these because, again, I say we want to use the current day slate for examples. Let's do it here. So first game on the slate, right? Rays and Yankees. And this has actually changed since right before I was coming on here. But we are higher on both of these teams, right? And we have seen here, neither of these trends have moved much since open. The one other thing you can look at is these trends. And actually right before I came on, these were both a little higher. It was actually 4-2 and 3-9. So I was planning on talking a little bit different about this game, but that's why it's always important to look as close as you can to lock, right? We're still getting lineups now. We're still getting pitchers confirmed. So this information is going to change, but it's interesting to look at this, right? So, we are slightly higher on this game. It hasn't been a lot of line movement, right? So I will just kind of start taking notes and thinking about where we stand. I'm just going to keep going through these and then we'll come back and talk. So Twins Orioles, right? We are pretty much right on with the Orioles, and we are about a half run lower on the Twins. And again, no real movement. Sometimes I'll take notes on these too, just so especially on a big slate, just so I can kind of stay like I can remember everything. Let's keep going. We'll get to some here in a second that I think are going to start to get pretty interesting. So Miami and Toronto, this game we are almost right on 3-9, 4-8, 3-9, 4-7. Not a lot of movement. Here's one of the first interesting games of the slate, I think, where there's kind of a significant difference between SaberSim and Vegas. And there's a handful of these games on a big slate like this that I think are kind of the pivot games that really make up your edge that you have on the slate, right? So Phillies and Reds, it is Nola and Sonny Gray on the mound here, 2 kind of highly projected pitchers. And we have this game at 4-5 Phillies, 4-2 Reds, and Vegas has it at 3-7 and 3-9, right? So definitely start to see a little bit of a discrepancy there. And one thing I will start to look at, and we talked about last week, is looking at the overall trends of where the line has moved to, right? So this has slightly moved up for the Phillies. It has moved up almost a half run for the Reds. I think that is somewhat encouraging here. That is moving towards SaberSim. But what you can also look at is actually this line movement graph here. And you can get an idea of kind of where there is resistance in the betting markets to it moving higher, right? So the Reds have actually been now at 3.9. This is their highest total of the day. You can see it in the chart here, and could conceivably still get a little bit higher. That's the team we're also the closest on, right? The Phillies, on the other hand, has only moved up a tenth of a run. It found some resistance at 3.8 runs, and it seems like this is a little bit more kind of closer to where it's going to be. Again, this is analysis that like I probably would not go this deep into until the lineup cards are all out, because a lot can change, but I just want to talk through in detail a little bit more about what I might be looking for here. So this is one, right, where SaberSim is going to be more bearish on some of these stud pitchers than the field. So something to note, right? Maybe you're taking notes, however you want to go about doing it. And we'll keep moving. The next game here, Washington-Atlanta, is another game that I think is going to be kind of one of those pivot games. This is probably the game that we are most dramatically different from at the moment, and I think we'll probably continue to be higher on this game. We have 5-0 runs for the Nationals and 4-8 runs for the Braves, right? So we are full run over, just a little bit over for the Braves now. And if we look, we've seen the Nationals went up to 4.2. They came back down to 4 on that line. So there is some resistance at like 4.25. The Braves have gone up to 4.9, and there was some resistance there. They came back down to 4.6. The Braves were actually very close on. The line has moved throughout the day towards us, so I feel pretty good. But the Nationals is a very interesting one, right? This line has moved towards us throughout the day, but it is seeing resistance at like 4.2, and we have it at 5.0. So this is a team that we are very bullish on their hitting. Max Fried is on the mound for the Braves. I think we are probably, you can kind of correlate this here. We are very relatively low on him. He's pretty cheap, and we don't have him at a very good value. This is an important game of the slate. And then I'm going to just keep us moving. I don't think I'm going to actually sit here and analyze all 14 games because we're going to run out of time doing this live, but I'm going to talk about one other big pivot game that kind of here is at the moment, and that's Boston and Houston, where we are at 4.5 for Boston and 4.8 for Houston. And we are pretty close to Houston here. And the Red Sox have basically cratered as the day has gone on. They are now projected for under 4 runs. You can see it's still kind of in a free fall. It hasn't really even seen kind of a floor yet. And that's another thing that is interesting and to take a look at here, right? So this line is quickly moving away from us. We are coming down on this as well. We had 5-1 earlier this morning, so this is coming down too as more information about the game is coming out. I think the big thing that moved the line for us earlier, or the SaberSim line, was just closing the roof. We had an open roof, I think, projected in our simulations. It looks like that roof is probably going to be closed, so we closed it. The totals came down, but we're still pretty high on this game, right? So let's see. We've talked about a couple games in detail here. So let's go ahead. We talked about Philly and Cincinnati, right? This is a game that has good pitching on the mound that we are a little bit higher on. We talked about Washington in particular, we are much higher on. And we talked about Boston and Houston, so we are also higher on with more value pitching on the mound. And again, maybe you're going through and analyzing all the teams on the slate when you're actually doing your own research here, but let's now run our test build and just see what we are getting out and get an idea of how this is kind of influencing the build, right? And if you don't have time to, right, like we've been talking here for about 15, 20 minutes about this, probably closer to 15 on this topic, right? This isn't something that you have to do in detail for every 14-game slate. There are little cues. You can kind of fit this to what your process is and how much time you have, right? Like maybe you don't have time to analyze the difference between SaberSim and the Vegas odds on every single game, but you can look at the teams where the Vegas odds have shifted dramatically throughout the day, and maybe you want to spend a little special time getting an idea of how is SaberSim looking at the Reds, the Red Sox, the Tigers, the Dodgers. That's it. Every team that's moved almost 0.4 runs over the course of the day, and doing this kind of analysis for that team. But I thought this would be building a little faster in the background here. All right, cool. Keep talking on this subject for a little bit longer. Big Sub, I see you had a question. We will get to that before the end of the show here. Yeah, let me keep us going here, and then we'll come back around to some of these last questions. So let's look at this now, right? So we can now start to kind of think, like, what's coming out of this? Maybe we go back and look at a couple teams, and just overall, how are we feeling? So one thing to me that would be a potential flag, and it's a flag partially because when I ran this an hour ago to prepare for the show, we were getting a ton of Washington, right? Just an insane amount of Washington, 35% now, right? For the team, the single team that we are projected over a run greater than Vegas, to me, isn't a huge concern, right? What would possibly be concerning about this to me is if this was 100 like it was earlier. Maybe that would be an indication that I want to bring them down a little bit, because we're so much higher than Vegas, and the line has moved just a little bit, that maybe I don't want to be in that particular spot with that team. Let's look at some teams that we are different from, right? So Red Sox, right? Red Sox is gone. They've almost dropped a full implied run. I would be curious if we have any Boston bats. We don't. So that's another situation where, like, I'm feeling somewhat okay about that. Right? Like we're really high on Boston, compared to the Vegas, but I'm not getting a lot of Boston bats. I'm okay with that. And then we can kind of keep looking here and seeing. So another thing that strikes me here, getting quite a few lineups with Sonny Gray and Nola. So we're over the field right now on both of these pitchers. And what is interesting about that here, right? So let's look at these pitching games again. There's really two kind of interesting pitching games here going on, where we have on the Rays Yankees, we are over on this game, right? We have a higher total for both the Rays and Yankees. We're somewhat pessimistic about Glass now, and the same deal with Sonny Gray and Aaron Nola. But what we're seeing in the Phillies Reds game is that the line has come up a little bit from where it opened, whereas we're seeing some resistance to that line movement on the Rays Yankees game. So what that indicates to me is that I probably am a little bit more willing to trust our Glass now exposures. And I don't know if I want to be over the field on pitchers that we're already bearish on, and Vegas has slowly come up on over the day. So one way to do that would be to come here and adjust some of these down, and maybe you're picking a more even with the field approach on some of those pitchers. Let's go back here to step one and talk a little bit more about projections and what you can do with some of these team projections, right? So on a big slate, we, in general, are going to need, think about the right way to say this. We're less interested in searching for really harsh edges, and we need to push our edges a little bit less on a large slate like this, because a lot of people are just going to make mistakes, right? It's going to be harder to just be right, and being accurate, right? Being accurate with your projections is just going to take you further, because there's going to be a lot of people that aren't. There's going to be a lot of people without accurate projections. Ownership is going to be so spread out that we don't need to play as much of a ownership leverage game. And the build settings typically will reflect that. So we will see on a contest for a slate like tonight, right? Ownership fade comes down all the way to moderate. Baseball is a variant game. We always have some ownership fade, but it's much lower than it would be on a smaller slate. So we account for that with some of the build settings, but we can also account for that in a little bit of the way we think about the slate, right? So let's go back and look at Washington. We were getting like 35% Washington stacks. Maybe we're just okay with that, but we're a full run over Vegas, and we are seeing that there is resistance from Vegas at just 4.2 or something like that. Actually, let's take an example of a team where the line, because this is a little bit of a gray area. Let's use an example of a team where they have gone like very clearly opposite direction of SaberSim. So would be a good example of that. I actually think today we're pretty aligned. No, let's stay with what we were looking at, right? So we like Washington, right? We're seeing that there's resistance at 4.2. It has climbed it from where it started at 3.7. The line has moved closer to where we are at 5.0, but it doesn't look like maybe it's going to move a lot further unless we get a surprise news with the lineup, right? So this is a situation where you can still have a lot of your edge, and maybe you're meeting the line in the middle here. And we're still a half run over on the Nationals overall, right? Same thing with the Red Sox. This is a team that the public or the sharp money or big money is just very pessimistic on tonight comparatively from where we are. And we can still be over the field, right? We can still take a somewhat contrarian approach to Boston. We aren't getting any Boston bats with 20 lineups, but maybe we would be with 150. And we can still take that approach, but get a little bit closer to Vegas here and still kind of generally have that approach where we're almost hedged a little bit. We're still allowing ourselves to be contrarian overweight on that team. But we're not committing 35% of our lineups necessarily to a team like the Nationals or something like that. Let's look. I want to see. I want to use another example. So let's go back. Let's go back to like the Phillies and Reds here, right? A team that we have projected for some of the top end pitchers on the slate, probably some higher owned pitchers on the slate, and maybe see what we want to do with that game, right? So this is another one where the line has come up a little bit throughout the day. It's gotten closer to us, but it's not all the way there. Maybe we leave the Reds alone, right? It's climbed 0.4 runs. We are only 0.3 runs higher than their total now. But the Phillies, we're seeing a lot of resistance right around this 3.8 line. So maybe we bring this down here a little bit too and bump that down. So this is kind of a good way that you can use some of these trends. You know, I right before this show, we had some trends that were a little bit, I'm bumping a lot of these totals down. Some of these lines have moved, and SaberSim has rerun Sims, obviously. So some of these things have changed. There actually aren't really any teams now. I was looking here where the line is like dramatically running away from us anymore, which makes sense. We've resimmed, gotten a little bit tighter. So when I say the line is running away from us, what I'm basically saying is that let's say, so the Twins opened at 5-1, right? And we have them at 4-7. If this was climbing and getting further away from us and had already opened higher than us and it proceeded to get higher, that's kind of what I'm referring to. And that's fairly strong signal that maybe you should take a closer look at that team. I did see it on NBA though, so let me check NBA and see if it's still the case. So yeah, I think it is. So let's look at NBA here. Okay, so here's an example, and this is a much smaller effect. But for the Nets tonight, right, we have them at like 120.5 points. Vegas opened at 121.75, and they have proceeded to get a little bit higher on the Nets as the day has gone on. So this is one where, to a lesser extent, the line is moving away from us. To me, this would be a somewhat stronger signal, even though we're talking about like maybe a point or two to maybe bump up a projection there. That's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of the trends that you can be looking for. So baseball, again, it is looking like even on the teams that we are higher or lower than, they have moved our direction throughout the day. So, oops. The last thing I will talk about here too is we definitely... Okay, so now Boston's come up a little bit. This is interesting. I end up watching these throughout most of the day, seeing where these lines move. So the one other thing I'll talk about here is often get some questions about ownership and like ownership seeming wrong on guys, and that is totally fine. You can do a lot in terms of adding value to your process by looking at just live lines close to lock and making some adjustments there. Something I will do sometimes is, especially on baseball, right, is I will just take notes and jot down the teams with the lowest implied totals and basically take the team playing against the lowest implied total teams across the entire slate and then just correlate that to the ownership rankings here on the side. And just looking at pitchers, for example. And you can very quickly get an idea of where you can maybe make some small tweaks. So I actually did this earlier this morning. Ownership has since reran, and we've gotten some different numbers here. But you can do this pretty quickly, right? So like Glasnow, Ray, Sonny Gray, Nola, Boyd. That's your top 5 in terms of projected ownership of pitchers. And we can just check those teams against them, right? So Glasnow's facing the Yankees. It's a correlating run total. Their run total is pretty low. I think they're probably likely going to be, I think he's likely going to be a highly owned pitcher. Same thing with Ray against the Marlins, who have a low total. We already talked about this game, low total. Those all make sense. The one that really sticks out is Boyd to me, where is the Tigers. He's going against the Brewers, 4.3 run total. Obviously, salary has something to go into this, right? Like Boyd's salary is just super low. But personally, something I've noticed is that a lot of people chase these lines. I think people are going to find other values instead of Boyd, and maybe you just drop him down like half. And you can do this the other way too, right? So pitchers that I think are likely to be highly owned that I'm not seeing on this list so far are Chris Bassett, who's up against the Mariners, and probably both sides of this game, Heaney and Alex Wood. Right? Those are some pitchers that I think should probably be a little bit higher. And I don't see them. I see Bassett here approaching, but like my particular perspective on the way I think this ownership is going to fall. Oh, Heaney is up here, top 5. But I think Alex Wood is likely to be a play that people go to a little bit more than some of these other guys. And maybe I'm just tweaking their ownership up a bit, right? You can get a lot from these lines, right? Like it's very useful in assessing chalk. Same thing with hitting. Right off the bat, 5 run total teams. You have the Twins. You have the Astros now. That moved up. You have the Dodgers. And then you've got Coors. I would say this secondary chalk is probably going to be some of these 4, 8, 4, 9. So you've got like Rockies, Rangers, Royals. To a lesser extent, the Blue Jays, right? You can start looking at batters and seeing, these ownerships. And this should like correlate to you. And if it doesn't, it's a good place that you can add a little bit of value, right? Like I see Washington is a highly projected owned team at the moment, which is probably a little bit inflated because we have them at such a high projected team total. So one thing you can do here, very quick for just like quick edits. Sometimes I will just cut these in half and just kind of work from there, at least as a starting point, and adjust this team and go down and cut some of these totals. So same thing here, right? We're under on the Twins. They're not really popping in terms of ownership. So now we have the Twins lead off. I think the Twins, personally, I mean, my take with what I'm seeing right now, I think that the Twins and the and Coors are going to be like the mega chalk tonight. So another way you can just go ahead and start adding in some additional ownership onto these guys. And I'm just doubling these two. And I know this isn't necessarily mathematically always going to work out because there are ownership calculations and things that take place to make sure, like, for example, on DraftKings, your total pitcher ownership should always be 200% because every lineup has 2 pitchers in it. We won't always have that exactly, but this is just another way you can kind of edit some of these numbers around, right? Continue to add value by looking at lines and looking at Vegas as signals in your process. So I probably could have continued to go on, talk about this longer. I hope that was useful, kind of clearer there. We get a lot of questions about like, what should I edit? Like, when should I edit these teams and ownership and player projections? And those are all really good questions. A lot of the value you can add takes place here by looking at some of those signals. So I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of a way to kind of think about doing that.